Hello everybody, Adrian Plass here, and I'm not alone. This week Bridget is back.
I am. I haven't just got back. I got back on Saturday, but I am back. You are right.
And you're back from...
Well, I'm back from South Africa, which I don't know if you mentioned, it really said about the context of it. I didn't just waft off to South Africa. This was our step-granddaughter's wedding. In fact, it was a postponed celebration because her husband is from Australia, she's from the UK, they're both doctors, and they met in South Africa and decided that they would like to get married there. So they booked this place, and then COVID happened and they never got there. They got married in Australia because they had to for the visa, and this was the big celebration several years later. And big it was, and beautiful it was. It was stunning.
We've been 2 or 3 times, haven't we, to South Africa, and mainly sort of work, wasn't it, to do with various charities and things. So how did it feel?
Not the first time wasn't with a charity.
No,
the first time was a very simple phone call that really threw you into a very unusual
Yeah,
world.
I remember it very well. I remember being in the kitchen and lady phoning and saying, I'm speaking from South Africa, and saying, how would you feel about doing a speaking tour here in South Africa? And I'd heard quite a lot about people doing tours, Christian things.
I mean, this was
and
apartheid was rife. I mean, this
it was just the year before the election, so it was a very difficult time. And I knew that there had been teams of Christians with speakers with their team going and having I said, well, I don't think I can. I don't have a word for South Africa. And she actually said, I'm really glad you haven't. Everybody else has got a word for South Africa. We don't want you to do that. We'd like you to come and make us laugh. We find it difficult to sleep at night here.
I do. That's right.
And when she said that, I thought, well, I can't. I said, I thought I can actually probably do that. So then I said yes, and I went. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is interesting that, isn't it? Everyone had a word. I mean, when you're not in the problem, it's much easier to see what you think people should do.
Well, we're beginning to realise, aren't we, that everyone thinks they know what to do in a situation that they're not embroiled in.
They're not embroiled
It's
in.
very, very easy to be critical and to give really clear advice in simple steps when you're not actually... right in the middle of it.
It is, and of course the election was a success, if you like. I mean, there was no bloodshed, or very, very little. It was very peaceful. Mandela became the first black leader of South Africa, which is such a huge thing, isn't it?
It's massive, but for me it was the first time. It was a very insignificant first, but the first time. I mean, we've been in a number of countries where we were in danger because of because we were looking at a particular kind of work all over the place. But it was the first time I'd been to a country where people almost casually said, if we get to a crossroads and we suddenly shoot away again, don't worry, because it's just that we might be about to be attacked and we'll have to shoot off. And I suddenly became aware, when I heard some of the stories, that I was in a different world altogether. Yeah. And so that sub-narrative of danger was with me throughout that first journey.
Yes, and of course you were staying with people who were in actually very beautiful houses, white houses, behind fences with massive signs saying immediate armed response. And I think one of the things that I noticed going back after all these years was that unfortunately not everything is resolved, and the first place we stayed had immediate armed response. If you didn't set the alarm right and you didn't turn it off straight away, which is what happened to some friends of ours who were there, immediately you get somebody there checking whether you've actually been broken in. And of course the reasons are the same. Poverty is still visible everywhere.
Was it visible from where you were for this wedding thing, or was it a sort of plush venue?
It was beautiful where we were, and you looked out over the mountains, and I thought, well, whatever the mess is, God did create this. It was so beautiful. But as soon as you go along the road there, I mean, they don't call them townships anymore. In fact, I discovered there's a phrase that I hadn't ever heard, and that's the people born after apartheid. They are described as born free.
All right.
And I'm sure some of them are. I mean, I went to a beach with one of the people who was there, and it was just wonderful, Adrian. I mean, this was not in any way a township. This was a lovely beach. I was probably the only white person there, but there was no sense of it being threatening or difficult. These were families having a lovely time.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have been able to move into some great jobs and have influence and live a really good life.
Yeah.
But there's an enormous but. And the area that they now call an area of informal housing, which was the township and basically is a slum, stretched for miles.
And what kind of housing are you
miles.
talking about nowadays?
Well, do you remember when we first went together, which was the year after the elections, and we flew into Johannesburg, and afterwards we visited Soweto, and you wrote a poem then. It must have been 95, and just read it. I hunted it out because I thought, is it still true?
Oh, well, this was it anyway. South Africa was lovely from the air, but as we spiralled to Johannesburg, we wondered why they'd let those fields of litter desecrate the landscape for so many miles around the city edge. Perhaps they didn't care. Perhaps they found it easier to blank it out than bother to recycle it or bury it beneath the ground. But is there not a likelihood, we thought, that in the end the problem will grow mountainous, the stench of foul neglect become obscene, until that mountain falls towards the city, toppling irreversibly and covering the part of town that prides itself on staying clean?
I never thought, Adrian, that when we went at that time, that going so long afterwards, the situation would still be there. As I say, there is hope. There's no doubt about it, and for a lot of people, that is not their situation now. But for far too many people, unfortunately, unemployment is the very highest in the world, I think, in South Africa. And do you remember when we went into Soweto and we went into this big, wonderful mission meeting? The prayer, the miracles that were celebrated.
Testimonies were all about work, weren't they? Yeah.
All about getting a job.
Getting a job, yeah, that's right.
And as we drove along and we saw people walking at 6 o'clock in the morning purposefully, probably walking miles to a job, I thought, they've got a job. And then I thought, they've got a job that will give them enough money to put some food on the table that evening, but never enough to be able to move out of this area that they're living in.
Yeah.
So I had some mixed old feelings.
Yes, I'm sure.
The wedding was
you
glorious.
were in the middle of luxury.
Oh, we
with
were.
These what do you say they call them now?
Well,
not townships anymore.
Oh no, they call them areas of informal housing, rather
Areas
like
of
we
informal
talk about
housing.
areas of social housing
yeah,
now.
yeah.
We don't use the terms council estates. It did make me very sad, Adrian. I mean, I know that within those places there will be communities that are functioning.
Yeah,
We know
of course.
that ourselves.
Yeah.
The first time we really visited a slum, we visited our sponsor child in Bangladesh, didn't we?
We did, yeah, and their family could have been lifted up and put in a town in England, and they'd have settled. They were very close, very warm,
And very functional.
and very functional.
Yeah,
but
they were.
they lived on nothing.
Yeah.
And the father was a rickshaw man, and he was working 7 days a week, all day,
Yeah.
to support the others.
Yeah.
One or two of the other memories of South Africa are interesting. I mean, when it did come, when the elections came and everything did change, I mean, we understand little or nothing about this, but I do remember things that I thought were interesting. And they were all signals that when this had happened, when apartheid had gone, or when it had started to go, which is more truthful, I suppose, that people would have a bit of trouble working out who they were and what had happened to them. And I remember one lady who worked in the house where I was staying, I remember her particularly because I made my bed one morning and she got quite annoyed with me because
I'm sure
her job was to make the bed and my job wasn't to make the bed.
Yeah.
So I apologised for making my bed, which is the first time I've ever done that in my life. Because our rule, I seem to recall from 53 years ago, is that the last one out of bed makes the bed, isn't that right?
Which is why it's usually you, but that's another whole story.
Anyway, she said to me quite casually one day and conversationally, when Mr. Mandela is president, this will be our house. And I thought, will it? And obviously it wasn't. So there's one little capsule of expectation that wasn't. And then if you look at many of the white South Africans, rather like the fellow I met in Northern Ireland who had gone back to his Christian roots after being a paramilitary leader and didn't know who he was and was trembling. And the same for a lot of white people, well, rightly or wrongly, whatever the past, whatever the future, they were gazing into the distance thinking, who are we now? Now that we've done the right thing, what do we? How do we look at ourselves?
And you get reformers. You always have. You always do. There still will be. You get charities. You get people wanting to make a difference. You also get very frightened people, desperate to hang on to what they've got, and you've got ruthless people who aren't going to want to let it go, because the difference between the haves and the have-nots in many countries, really. I think it applies in India. I think it applies, where the extreme is so great. And totally coincidentally, I was showing you something, wasn't I, in a book by Harper Lee, and it's not To Kill a Mockingbird. It's
Harper
the one.
Lee is the author of.
I was just going to say, she wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, incredibly famous book, but I hadn't realised that she'd written a book before that, which wasn't quite as good, and it was published much later. But in it, the main character is now an adult scout, and she is desperately unhappy to find that the father that she had idolized because of what he'd done for one particular young black man who'd been accused of rape by a white woman, and it was a sort of casebook case, and he'd done incredibly well in that, although he hadn't managed to get a reprieve totally. But that he was now pulling back from an extreme movement forward for Negroes in Alabama in the 30s. And the writer explored an image that we were talking about for some time, weren't we, afterwards? Because what was happening was that the powerful black leaders were pushing really hard for total change, so that people from that tradition could be in leadership roles. And they were not ready for that yet, because they hadn't had the education that the white people had had, and because they were coming out of slavery. And she used the image of a plane, didn't she? And she said, the danger is that if you're nose heavy, in other words, pushing before actually it's the right time, you're likely to nosedive and crash. But if you're tail heavy and you're pulling back, completely determined that nothing is going to change, you're tail heavy and you'll crash, and that the balance is in the middle. And when I looked at these slums as we were driving along, I thought, somebody's given up somewhere, and it's become, like you said in your poem, it's become so huge that the problem is bigger than any easy solution. You know, whichever way you go, you're likely to put the thing out of balance, and maybe then nothing happens at all.
Yeah, it's interesting. Looking back, it was so tense then, and it was very difficult to keep perspective because one is so ignorant. You go into a country like that, and you feel such an idiot, really, because you really don't know what's going on. And I mean, talking of perspective, I mean, when we were there, we went to where was it? We went with the fellow with the Coke and the pie. Wanted the Coke and the pie.
That wasn't that time. It was much later, wasn't it? We went to
matter,
East London.
Yeah,
which is along the coast the other way from Cape Town.
We were doing a mission in a church there.
We were, and it was at the time when AIDS was rife, and South Africa had not really faced up to what was really happening in the way that other countries we'd been, hadn't we, to Zambia, where they got much better grip on what was happening, on how to at least try and keep it under control.
Very solid planning there, wasn't there?
But in South Africa at that time it was total denial.
Yeah.
And we went, didn't we, we heard about a hospice, which we pictured being a nice, neat building with people, fully trained people, dealing with people who were at the end of their lives with
it was
AIDS.
a very impassioned attempt to have a hospice.
It was so sweet.
It just hadn't quite got there, but we were taken in to see a young man who was clearly coming towards the end of his life, and
they'd put beautiful curtains up, pretty things to try and make it nice, but they had no understanding about how you nurse somebody in that situation.
And we asked if he would like us to pray for him, which obviously we would, and we asked what he would like us to pray for. Well, of course,
he didn't say
in England.
No, but he didn't say at the time, did he?
No.
He didn't. Do you remember? He didn't say at the time. Afterwards, we heard that he knew exactly what had happened within the prayer, and that we had prayed for him to have
a meat pie and some Coca-Cola.
That is what he had heard. I mean, we had prayed for
the usual
possibly
things,
physical healing, but certainly peace.
And
that he would understand how much God loved him.
No, I remember the Coca-Cola and the pie.
And a Coca-Cola.
And they said to us, didn't they, that often people coming into the hospice that's what they wanted. That was their top meal, and if there was any way of getting that would be wonderful. But it was very plaintive. Very plaintive.
Yeah, but it was quite good for us, wasn't it? I mean, any idea that we were the great, great what's-its.
I've never been able to feel a great what's-it in situations like that, I'm afraid. And I also remember, in our house here, we have the remains of I'm not sure which country this was in, the remains of something made by a local man.
Oh, it was in Bangladesh.
No, it wasn't Bangladesh. But anyway, wherever it was made because he told us what it would cost, and we've been told you should always haggle in these places. I can't remember where it was actually, and so we did. I mean, it didn't matter because he was asking such a small amount. But
it's that funny feeling that you shouldn't allow yourself to be ripped off, isn't it? That's foolish in some way. That's right.
So in the end, we stuck to our guns, and we didn't need to even, but we did, and I don't really quite know why. And I remember him saying, looking rather upset and saying, "But I need more for food tonight," and we've still got the remains of that thing he made. That I feel so guilty every time I look at it.
But it is there as a reminder,
isn't
I know,
it?
It's a reminder that
we're
so afraid to let go of something or other. It wouldn't have mattered if he felt he'd got something out of us for that one day and went home triumphant.
No, of course and I wouldn't have minded either. No. I looking back, it's rather odd. I can't really even. I think it was just you get a lot of advice when you go to places like that, and people are so strong with it. So anyway, that's what we did. I don't know. The memories from that time are very pungent, and especially going before the elections, and then for me going after the elections when we went with the children, and discovering that at least it hadn't been the bloodbath that some people had talked about, and feeling relieved that things could be moving forward. But yeah, the history of the country since then is not very encouraging, and it's a bit sad to hear that it was so clearly unchanged as far as you could see.
Well, I don't know. I mean, as I say, going to this beach, I felt some things had changed. But what was the last line in your poem about the... What was it that you wrote?
And until that mountain falls towards the city, toppling irreversibly and covering the part of town that prides itself on staying clean.
Yeah. Well, Cape Town is the most beautiful city, surrounded by the most amazing mountains. Well, we all know Tabletop Mountain, but it's a range of mountains. Beautiful. Verdant, there's the whole wine area. It is beautiful, and you could think, well, who wants that changed?
Yeah, but the problem's still there.
How you hold on to the hope that things can change and that things can be fairer. And I suppose you come down to the fact that the miracles are the small things, as we're always saying. The person who does treat somebody with tremendous respect. What was it you said? There were 3 words: warm, wary and willing. That was your sort of code for...
What's the only code I've ended up with? I think the warm comes first,
warm,
the wary comes second, and the willing becomes second.
And you do need to be wary. You do need to be wary. A lot of the young people in this group are very good runners. One of them said, I have a dilemma. I've been told never to take my mobile phone out, but if I don't take my mobile phone out, I have no sat-nav and I could end up in a very rough area.
Right.
And I thought, well, that's interesting.
Yes.
But there we are. No, we just have to keep praying and keep hoping that there are ways forward.
Yeah. It's a very strange thing hearing about that. And I can't quite process it at the moment.
And within it, to enjoy the things that we are given. And I did enjoy the wedding. It was a wonderful, wonderful time.
I'm glad about that.
Yeah.
So there we are. You're back, and you'll be here again next week. So we'll see you next week.